All right, well, this is the first in a three-part series we're going to talk a little bit about water. The first part here is going to be talking about what a water-based economy and what that means to us here locally. Next Saturday, we'll talk a little bit about profiteering and public trust. And then we'll end it up on the 17th with a discussion about what a water-based future could look like. Okay. As a reminder, all sources of water within Nevada and actually within Utah, because I'm going to talk a little bit about Utah, belongs to the public. And I think that's an important thing to understand. Oftentimes people think that it is often defined as a property right or a real estate right. But that's a little ambiguous because by statute, it belongs to us. When I talk about water, I'm talking about water along the Colorado River Basin. And specifically, at least in this briefing, I'm going to talk a little bit about Lake Powell, St. George, Mesquite in the middle, Coyote Springs investment, and Las Vegas. Because all of those communities share the same desire for growth, but they're limited to some degree by water, which is what I'm going to address here. Now, in St. George, for several years, St. George and Kanab have proposed to draw water from Lake Powell. It's called the Lake Powell Pipeline. Now, that's a multi-billion-dollar project that would take hundreds of thousands of gallons of water from Lake Powell and pipe it to St. George and Kanab. Now, recently, actually within the last few days, the Washington County Water Authority has asked the Bureau of Reclamation to extend a period of time for comments on a study that has to be made about this pipeline. So that's still on the drawing board. And St. George, of course, is growing. Some parts of St. George have grown by 20%. Washington City, which is next to St. George, has grown by 50%. So they're pushing growth without really knowing that they're going to have water supplies. And that's kind of what the Lake Powell pipeline is all about. Now, closer to home, some of you may have heard about the Great Basin water grab, which was an attempt by the Southern Nevada Water Authority to take water from Spring Valley, Cave Valley, Dry Lake Valley, and Delmar Valley, and pump it to Las Vegas to accommodate their growth. And they're growing roughly 3 to 4% a year. Now, we have to take into account the present virus situation and the potential of a recession. But the idea here in terms of this briefing was grab more water to help us with our growth. By the way, that particular water grab has been objected to in the courts, and recently the courts have declared that it's illegal to take that water. And the Southern Nevada Water Authority has decided not to appeal that particular project. So the Great Basin water grab is over with. Now, some of you may be familiar with Coyote Springs. Coyote Springs lies, roughly 50 miles north and somewhat east of Las Vegas, and about the approximate same distance from Mesquite. Now, the original proposal was to propose a development that you'll see here in this particular picture. And that would have taken roughly 40,000 acre feet of water. Well, this is the project as it stands now. That water is not available. And it it became unavailable through a study of 6 different basins that would have contributed water to that particular project. And the Nevada water engineer combined these basins into what they call the Lower White River flow system. And what's interesting about that, it gets to this issue of what paper water means. Now, on paper, they thought they had a combination of water. They thought they had about 48,000 acre feet of water, but the perennial yield was only about 7,100. Now, these people hate numbers, and I understand that. But when it came right down to it, the state engineer said, you only have about 8,000 acre feet, and the 30,000 acre feet of water you wanted for that Coyote Springs development, that ain't happening. So the Coyote Springs development, they thought they had water, they projected they had water, and they don't have water. Now that water amount that the state engineer said was available, the Coyote Springs wanted around 30,000 acre feet. There's only about 7,000 or 8,000 acre feet that's going to flow through all of those 6 basins. Part of that water flow, according to the water engineer, was to protect the Moapa dice, a small fish that is in the Muddy River. So there had to be water available to serve that particular fish and to satisfy some water rights. So this is another example of people planning for a project without having really understanding what their water is going to be. Now this is the Lower White River flow systems. I showed the numbers on that earlier. What I want people to understand is these are the basins that went from an estimated 48,000 acre feet to roughly 7,000 acre feet after they looked at it. And it's close to our basin, the Virgin River Basin here, 222. So the issue is, to some degree, if you look at all of these basins and they're over permitted and they only have a small amount of water, and that killed off the Coyote Springs investment and so on. What is our basin? Well, historically, you can call the Mesquite, I kind of like to refer to it as a river irrigation-based economy. From the time it was established, they took their water primarily from the Virgin River. And that water was available primarily for irrigation purposes. And that was the primary source of water for many years. More recently, however, we've evolved into a culinary or underground-based community. And the amount of river water that it's no longer needed for its original irrigation purposes. What we need is culinary water. And so in 1993, to meet that demand for culinary water, the legislature set up the Virgin Valley Water Board and Water District. And they take water out of Basin 222 in the previous slide. And they take water, primarily underground water. But like that Lower White River area, their permits actually exceed the amount of water that is available in that particular basin. In that particular basin, they project that there's only 3,600 acre feet of perennial yield. That's the amount of water that can be taken out of an underground resource without damaging the resource itself. The Virgin Valley Water District's taken about 7,000 acre feet. Now the slide or this particular slide and the particular numbers on the left actually show the total amount of permits and other things that are taken from that basin. And the key numbers to watch here is it's over permitted by 100, they've given out permits for 194,000 acre feet. In total, across the whole basin, not just the Virgin Valley Water District, there's only 100,000 acre feet. All those numbers may seem confusing, and they are. The point to that particular slide is just to say that that basin is over permitted. The Virgin Valley Water District has permits in excess of what they can actually take, and they're taking more water than can be refreshed. So here again, and like the other areas that I've talked about, we have the same issue: growth, 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 without really considering how much water we have. Now, there is somewhat of a difference between how much water goes to Las Vegas and goes to the Virgin Valley Water District. 90% of the water that goes to our friends in Las Vegas comes from Lake Mead, with another 10% coming from underground resources. Here in the Virgin River, 25% comes from surface water, primarily the Virgin River, and 75% comes from underground resources. The purpose of this is to show you can't really compare what they're doing in Las Vegas and how they're getting their water to how we're getting our water. Most of the water in Las Vegas comes from surface water from Lake Mead. We only take a small amount from the Virgin River. Most of our comes from these underground sources that, as I mentioned, are over permitted and so on. So here's the danger. If we continue to grow without considering water, we can easily find ourselves in the same position that other communities have found themselves. This happens to be the Salton Sea, an area in Southern California that lost essentially all of their water for a variety of different reasons. And now it's they have a few trailer houses and a few abandoned trailer houses. Now, obviously, we don't want to see anything like that. So what we need to do is we need to consider this equation between growth and water and put that in some kind of a balance. As I've said, all around us, whether we're talking about St. George and their attempt to get more water from Lake Powell, whether we're talking about Coyote Springs and that investment that failed, or whether we're talking about Las Vegas, they're all in this mindset of growth over water. We need to reverse that. I'll take any questions you might have.
Yeah, Mike, that pipeline from Lake Powell to St. George, do you think that'll become a reality? When would they even start on that? And how, I mean, it's going to take a long time to build, I would think.
Yeah, it will take a long time to build. Let me get rid of this stuff here if I can without, okay. It will take a long time to build, and it will cost billions of dollars. What's happening on that project at the moment is that the Utah senators like Mike Lee and that group who now has the COVID, they're pushing the Bureau of Reclamation to fast track that environmental study and actually start developing that particular pipeline. Now, as I mentioned earlier, their idea is as long as we have Trump in, we can probably get it done. And to pay for it with money that would come from a hydroelectric plant that they want to build and from selling water shares that they have. Now, on the other hand, as I mentioned also a little earlier, there has been a move by the Washington County Water Authority to say, we need to study this a little more, we need a little more time. They're going to have to do one of two things. They're either going to have to find more water or they're going to have to do something with their population.
Well, I remember hearing that people in St. George use twice the water they do in Phoenix or in Las Vegas or something like that.
And that's an important thing, because one of the things that keeps Las Vegas alive is their conservation effort. And I would certainly think that those people in Washington County and in St. George and the communities around there are going to have to do something, and they should have done that years ago, but you're absolutely right about that. But as long as there appears to be a political pressure to build this pipeline, I suspect that they won't do anything based on, hey, we'll have the pipeline thing. But conservation is the key, and conservation is the key here too, by the way.
Oh. I mean,
And the
they're
other,
saying Washington counties to grow to be 500,000 people. And I just, wow,
yeah,
they're going to
yeah,
get the water for that.
yeah, wow.
And you know what, how do we stand as far as the Virgin River and all?
Well, thank you for that. As I showed a little bit earlier, there's two sources of water for us. One, underground water, and two, river water from the Virgin River. There is a third source that has other uses, that's affluent, and there is a certain amount of spring water that comes out of the mountains, but primarily it's underground water and the river water. Now the projections at this time, according to the Virgin Valley Water District Master Plan, is to start searching for more water. Come up with about $40 million and start digging holes for more water. Now, as I mentioned earlier, that's somewhat problematic because they really have enough pumping capacity that actually exceeds their permits and their certificates. So where they think they're going to get that water, I have no idea. That's underground water. In the distant future, sometimes 8 years from now, they think they're going to pump water out of the river and clean it. And they plan to spend $60 million in capital outlays to clean that water. Now, there's problems with that. First of all, that $60 million to clean a certain amount of water is the capital costs. Operating expenses and personnel costs could equally double that. And the second problem with cleaning river water is for every acre feet you put through the cleaner, you only get half back. And the third problem with that is the cost of that, purchasing that water from shareholders, which I'll discuss more on at the next time.
Well, do they have the right to get into that river water? I mean, how much of that trickles down? I'm really not familiar with the Virgin River as much as in Colorado, you've got the Arkansas River.
Right, and over in Moapa, here they have what they call the Virgin River Decree. And that decree, 1927, was given to our local pioneers for irrigation purposes. It was allocated to those local pioneers for irrigation. And so they have that they acquired that public water to irrigate. Now, as we move from an irrigation-based economy to a culinary or underground-based economy, the value of that river water, because they were no longer, doing irrigation to any great degree, and the dairy operations have pretty well failed, that river water had a value of zero. They tried to auction off a couple of times and so on and so forth. All right, now, here's where we get into purchasing water. So what the Virgin Valley Water District, who originally was composed of shareholders of river water, and to a great extent, the water district, the water board still has water shareholders. So they spent $20 million buying shares of water to be cleaned sometime in the 2040 time period. Now these purchases were made between 1993 and 2010, incidentally. So that's how they get Virgin River water, is they lease or purchase shares from the descendants of these original pioneers. Now there's a legal problem with that, but that legal issue about whether you can actually do that has not been tested yet. So that's where they get the river water. Now, under all other sources of water in Nevada, you put in an application, you get a permit, you dig a hole, and eventually that water you're certified. And that gets back to what I was discussing earlier about we've exceeded the permits. There's no longer any permits on the basin. So the base case, if you want to call it that, is what we're doing now. That is, we have a certain amount of water that is permitted and certified, but we're taking more water out of the basin than the yield allows. I want to stress that. So we need to study that. We need to take a look at how much water we actually have, and then balance growth, around that particular water amount. And secondarily, we need to really take a look at the pricing issue on river water and the cost to clean it. So I hope that answers your question.
Well, it just seems to me that if we are having this water shortage, you need to let the economics work, and the prices need to go up to the point where it makes it very, very difficult, to use, like in St. George, twice the water of Las Vegas or Phoenix.
About the pricing, which I'll address next week, but it's public water. And as a public resource, there's no profit motive in that. As a public resource, the price of that water should be the cost to deliver it. You take into account, inflation and holding back some money for capital costs and all that, but it's the cost to deliver it. Now, the Water Board actually does a fairly decent job of costing our culinary water. As I've looked at their budgets, and it seems that we are paying what it costs to deliver that culinary water. There is an exception to that. Because they spent $20 million buying river water, they had to increase the cost of culinary water. So to some degree, it's not totally the cost to deliver, but because they tacked that on our bill. So to your point, if we were to take river water, the cost of that river water should be no more than the cost to deliver it and clean it. Not this profit stuff. That's a legal issue. So so we just, the bottom line to this is we need to know. We all need to know. I need to know. You need to know. And at the present time, what happens is the city council approves building permits. Those building permits are looked at by the water board, and the water board says, yeah, sure, we'll just dig more holes. So now, if there is any good news in this, it is that the water board has said, well, we'll study the water in 2023. My hope would be that if I were elected to that board, that we can sit down, talk about this, talk about the problems, and study it now. They took a $10 million bank loan, and some of that could certainly go towards a study. The danger, of course, is what happens if the study says, hey, the perennial yields were right. You're taking too much. That's a risk. So that's where we're at. And that's why, to some degree, that's why my candidacy is not too popular, because candidates that want to run for office, they don't usually run on a, hey, we may have to restrain growth ticket.
Do you see in the future any more golf courses in town?
Oh, the golf. Oh, yeah, of course. I'm a golfer. We're going to keep the golf courses and shut down houses. No, here's the thing.
I live on one. I see how much water that plane uses.
Here's the interesting thing about golf courses, and it's really a good move on the part of most of the golf courses, to some degree, use affluent. I mentioned that affluent was part of our, domain of water. And to some degree, at least a couple of the golf courses also use river water. Now, that affluent at our current growth, of course, is sufficient to handle the golf courses. And the river water that is used by at least a couple of, actually used by 3 of the golf courses, is sufficient enough to satisfy those without really any problem. Obviously, if our population were to decrease significantly, we wouldn't have as much affluent. But right now, the golf courses are in good shape. What's not in good shape is housing.
Where's the word affluent? I'm not sure what that means.
Oh, affluent is the water, you know, after you flush your toilet goes into the city cleaning area, the sewer kind of thing. That's affluent. And that water is cleaned and then pumped to the golf courses.
Okay, okay.
Yeah. And that's a great benefit to the city. I mean, it's to all of us. So it's not, here's the problem for businesses like the casinos. They're paying a lot of money for culinary water. They're paying, and the golf courses are paying in excess, in my opinion, for river water. So there's a cost issue associated with how the board is doing some of those things.
May I step in and say that comes into economics as well, because the golf industry is a $60 million driver,
right,
economically in the city of Mesquite.
right.
And I think Frank's question was, do you foresee additional golf courses, or we're at where you think we're going to stay?
That's right.
Given the amount of land that we have, and Sandy could probably answer this a little better than I can, but given the amount of land that we have and the housing projections that seem to be on the drawing board, there won't be any additional land for golf courses unless it comes from the BLM and, you know, that kind of stuff. So, and then of course, you know, whether the additional affluent would be there to support it and the additional river water, that's a question that would have to be answered.
Sandy, Sandy has a question and comment.
So Mike, you know, we talk about wanting to have that study. And I know that they're talking about doing one finally in 2023. And my understanding, the study takes about 5 years before we would have some answers. There seems to be, their big complaint is the fact that they don't have the money. They don't think they should have to pay for it. They believe that because Utah and Arizona takes water from that same basin, that they should have to pay for that study. And that's one of the reasons they've dragged their feet, other than the fact that they still believe they have all the water they're ever going to need.
Yeah.
So how do you address that issue?
Well, fortunately, the U.S. Geological Survey has models that they've developed on our basin, in fact, on the entire Great Basin. So they're not unfamiliar with the water issues here. The second thing is, in terms of the U.S. Geological Survey, they don't care that this basin goes into Utah and Arizona. I mean, that's not an issue in terms of the study itself. Now, I think asking Arizona and Utah to pay for a study that would benefit us, that's not going to happen. And it's a straw man, I think. There's just an excuse not to do it. Now, in terms of the money, what cost is ignorance? How much are we going to continue to grow and not have the water? The question needs to be answered. There are, as I mentioned, they've got a $10 million loan that they plan to dig holes in the ground to build wells for water that they don't have, at least don't have permits for. So they can use that money. The second source of money, I would think, should come from the city as part of their planning process. The city is spending a certain amount of money on their outsourcing their economic planning, so there should be a share there. And the third source, of course, is grants. There are grants available, and they have been available, and the Water Board, for as long as I can remember, has resisted looking at some of those. Although I will say that our former hydrologist did look into some of that. So I think the cost is not an issue, actually.
Well, as I remember, at least back in about 2010, when we had talked about doing this study before, US Geological was willing to pay half of that study.
That's
Do
right.
you think that's something they might still consider if approached right, or is that not something they would normally do?
Yeah, and they pay for it by in kind. In other words, they just assign their staff to do it and cut their costs. But yes, I think that's a very possible. There's a couple of other sources that can help on this. We have some pretty smart hydrologists at the University of Nevada in Las Vegas. That's one additional source of manpower. And I sometimes people forget that it was Wolf Creek that offered to put in, I think they offered $1 million to do that study. So there's a possibility of other sources of revenue. So one of the things that I would like to do is sit down with the other 4 members of the water board and say, look, let's plan this out, talk to the GS again, talk to the Bureau of Reclamation, get these costs ironed out, and go for the money and do it. It's not going to be any better in 2023. And we need to know the answer now, because the city continues to issue building permits. So the city's creating the demand to supply water that we're not sure we have.
Well, and the problem with the city doing that is the fact that when those building permits come to us, they come with a letter from the water district telling us they have that amount of water available. But if you read in the small print, the water district never does guarantee the water to be there.
That's right.
So people are still taking, they think they've got it. But if you really read the small print, it says we do not guarantee if this water isn't there. So there again, it's like they're trying to cover themselves, without really knowing, or without coming out and saying, we don't really know how much we have. If we're going to give you a permit and go ahead and go build, and hopefully we're going to have the water, when they've already said in that small print, we don't really know. So that's concerning.
And as you know, in 2019 legislative session, they passed a piece of law that said it's up to the cities and the counties to study water, take an inventory of water. That legislation also says that it could be done by the water district. So there is, in my mind, the city, does have a right, if they chose to say, we need to comply with that particular statute. We need to do the study.
Karen has a question. Karen has a question.
Yes, thank you.
Typical citizen, it just sounds to me from what I've learned from what you've told us today, the reluctance has to do with, for the study, has to do with the money involved. They feel they don't have enough money, and you've indicated there could be some sources. Could it be that there's a lack of sound planning, of budgeting, that for future, you have to put some money into the future, and that doesn't sound like that's happening. It sounds to me like they don't want to know how much.
Yeah, it's yes.
How much water there is.
As some of you may know, I have a pretty long history of government service, and government planning, government financing, government budgeting is different than the way the private sector does, and it's different than the way the water board does it. So because we're dealing with public resources, and they are a public body, I think they really need to take a whole relook at their planning process. For example, in the public world, you would take a look at what's our goal here. The goal is to deliver water. That's the first thing. The second thing is, okay, how much do we have? That's the second thing. And then the third thing is, okay, what's the demand? And you balance those things out so that you wind up with a kind of a cost benefit analysis. We only have that much water. We can only serve this much of the demand. And our budget, as I mentioned earlier, is only the cost to deliver that. That's how much we'll price it. That's not what they do. Their approach is to take a linear view of population. We're going to grow the population out to 70,000 people. And water's going to magically appear. That's their planning process. And in order to deliver that water, to meet that population demand, it's going to cost such and such. And instead of using science and USGS, for example, to determine how much water they have, they go to an engineering firm. And that engineering firm just says, well, what do you want to know? And the water board says, we have a population that's going out to 70,000 and we're going to need this amount of water. How much, how much is that going to cost us? So their planning process is completely wacky. And unfortunately, most people don't pay attention to that.
Well, it sounds like it is that there is fundamentally, they don't have a sound project planning goals.
Exactly. In fact,
that's where I think you come in with your government experience, that you learn these things. And
yeah, I could certainly help. Oddly enough, when Sandy was on the water board, I did talk to Sandy about a planning process, government planning process and budgeting process, and built up a plan on how to do that. And with Sandy's advocacy, I did present it to the water board, and they came back and said, well, no, we're not doing that. So, we're going to continue to do it the way we're doing it. We'll turn all of our things over to this contractor who's an engineering firm, and they'll count the number of people that we tell them we're going to grow to, and then tell us how many holes we have to dig. So.
Thank you, Mike.
Yes, thank you.